All right, hello everyone. So this is a lecture, continuing the topic of the gender and ethnicity and the sex. So as I will be traveling to the Philadelphia today from today to this Sunday. So we are having the alternative format of lecture as an asynchronous format. So as this is a replacement lecture, we will have the relatively shorter lecture video than the normal class. All right, so let's go. So we start our conversation in the missing girls issue, which means strong son preferences in those countries, I mean the East Asian and some of the Asian countries, that results in the some types of the discrimination and result in the missing girls issue, which means they could survive without the son preferences or their cultural traits, but because of the sex sexuality abortion and other types of the discrimination, many girls died because of those issues. So one child, John, we could see that on the fractional male, the proportion of the male would be very, very high in the one child John in China, which means there was a very big sex imbalance in those areas with the sex. The one child policy was applied. But other than that, so most of the other counties or other areas in China, which did not allow or which did not practice the one-child policy, they had a very natural levels of this fraction of the proportion of the males. So we can see that the fourth children. So the first child, there was no very huge sex imbalance. The second child would be fine. But third child and the fourth child and higher, which means the higher order of the births, which means the younger ones. So when they had the first one and the first child and the second child, they might feel to just kept it as it is. But the third child and the fourth child, they wanted to keep only boys, for example. So in South Korea, there was a very huge sex imbalance because of the strong son preferences. So we could see those phenomena of the missing girls would be very prevalent in China and India, but in South Korea as well, there was very big the issues of the missing girls. So child mortality by sex in the China and India, we can see, okay, so we can see that the child mortality of the girls and child mortality of the boys is going down and down, which means, yeah, it's not very a bad situation, but anyway, the children's mortality, they are going down. So even though it's going down, there was the issues of the sex imbalances. Alright, so China and India sex ratio at birth, there was a big fluctuations, but we could see that. So the higher number, so this is the number of males divided by the females multiplied 100. So higher than 100 means there are more boys. So in China, so it was Kenya, in India and China, there was very huge imbalance of the sexes at birth. We can see that there were more boys than girls, and India as well. So based on the fertility, the fertility and the sex ratio and actual sexual ratio, based on many of the results, we could see that there were the sex imbalance issues because of the strong son preferences. All right. So sex and the gender and sexual orientation. So by far, we learned about the issues relevant with the gender and the sexual imbalances in the birth and others. But there are also very huge on the phenomena of the gender differences. And other than the traditional forms of the dichotomy of the males or female or man or woman, now we are seeing the wider variety of the sexual orientation. So I'm not a gender scholar as a professional, so I don't know much about the super details. But now we have the 16 categories or 20 or 30 categories of the gender orientation. So we know that we might be very familiar about the heterosexuality or the homosexuality or bisexuality, but there are more: the asexuality, the pansexuality, omnisexuality, and queer, and there are many of the very detailed definitions. So we would not focus a lot because there would be more classes about the gender sociology or gender and sexuality. But we can see that there are these types of the differences. So there is no. So we had the discussion that whether the gender differences are by nature or by nurture, and you might see that and there are very mixed mechanisms, and that would be very true because it is in one hand side, on the one hand, that's very mixed, but on the other hand, there is no scientific consensus whether that's coming from their DNA or others, but also not sure about the that's coming from the socialization, the learning. So there has been no evidence by the American Psychological Association. So we are not putting any label or any of the very strong theory to define that as a definition. So they have the sexual orientation now in our on the course website and the university website. There are some options that put in the preferred pronouns. So I put my he, him, his because I'm the my sexual orientation is male, but probably there would be more. There are more details. So their can be accompanied by the guilt, the shame, and responsibility, and the uncertainty, because there are still the high levels of the labeling to the certain types of the sexual orientation. But this is not very static, which means it's very dynamic. So for example, they would have very traditional types of the gender orientation in the adolescent period time or the young adult time. But occasionally or eventually, they would realize they would have different gender orientation. So in the life course, in the lifespan, in the whole life, the sexual orientation may not be very, very fixed or static, but it could be very dynamic. So sex denotes the biological traits, and the gender is social and the cultural characteristics. So based on the socialization, also on their learning and like their life courses and their social setting, there would be their differences of the gender orientation or the gender characteristics. So these are the biological, sex, and the gender as a social. And there are also the gender roles. So you might already know that the gender, in terms of the traditional on gender, there are the traditional images of the males or traditional images of the females. So gender role refers to the society, the concept, the socially and in that society, the culturally defined roles to the gender. So males would do the breadwinner jobs, for example, in the United States, so as a traditional format. But women are doing the housework, for example, in the traditional gender. So these are types of the traditional gender roles. And childhood activities and the instructions are impactful to determine their levels of the gender traditional roles. And there are also the traditional gender roles in the feminine and the masculine, and these are impacting a lot in our life courses, in our peer group, in the school, or in the family. We learned a lot about those types of the gender stereotypes. So, for example, the crying. So you might see that if we are in the classroom, in the assumption, and assume that we are in the classroom, if somebody are crying, or you might be very astonished and surprised. But the level of the surprises and level of the astonishment would be very different. If the crier or if the people are crying, it would be male or the female. So the gender role of the transgender people, so not only on the gender orientation as a heterosexual or homosexual, we'll see the transgender issues in the United States. So in sociology, there are many of the terminology. The gender identity refers to gender development and internal perception, and the transgender people means that the behaviors and the characteristics that are other than their gender assigned at birth. So there will be differences. And the gender dysphoria is a condition listed in the DSM-5 in which people undergo a level of significant distress due to strong desire to be another gender for at least 6 months. So for example, they were born as a male, the biological male, but they would feel that they are the female, even though they were born the boys or the man. So we would see there are many of the conflicts and the contradiction between their biological gender and their desired and their gender. So there would be very high levels of stress resulting in the gender dysphoria. So there are also not only the gender orientation, but also the transgender identities. There are many types of the differences and the various complexities. And also the intersex and the individuals, they would change their sexual organs by the surgery and the hormones and replacing the sexual organs. So there would be sorry, my throat condition is not very good. So not always static and dynamic, and the biologically and the medical issues, they would not find it there and the intersex characteristic at their births, but as on the maturation in their lifetime, they could find the intersex issue later time. So that would be very, very different. And intersex. So in the common sense, you might see that the intersex and the transgender would be the same meaning, but they are very different as the terminology. So I would put those two videos so that we can have the more details, and I would ask you, so as an in-class activity, I will show you those two videos, and let's ask that which one would be more impactful and which one is more reasonable, or asking that whether the transgender or the intersex people might be participating in the competition in the high school or the Olympic or the other national level competitions. So there is no consensus as a nature or nurture, so whether these are biological traits or cultural expectations. So if we say the biology is destiny, these are saying that determinism. This is a sexual determinism because they are saying that their DNA and their biological traits at birth will determine everything. Every gender traits and every sexual traits, these will be determined. So as we could see in the previous slides, these are not static but dynamic. So we would see in social science, in contemporary social science, we would see the sexual determinism is not very, very widely accepted, as the biology is destiny terminology is not very widely accepted. So should transgender people or women be allowed to be in the sports? Yes or no? So that would be very different. And also the gender differences. The woman have it easier. There are the gender issues. So we could see that the first general in the woman in the army, there was 1970. And there were the 4 stars, the highest degree or highest rank in the military. That was the first happened 2008 in Army, 2012 in Air Force, in the Navy later 2014. And there is also the intersex and transgender highest rank in the military personnel, even though this is not in the former or the military personnel, but the first one, 2000, I remember that was 2 or 3 years ago, Dr. Rachel Levine, the transgender, the government official, appointed as the general, the highest rank of openly transgender official in the United States. So based on the socialization, the sexism is the prejudice belief that one sex should be valued over another. So behaving or putting the gender or the sex in the higher priority or higher preferences that might be considered the sexism. So there would be many types of experiences. So in gender, in school, for example, if we are forced to behave as a specific gender, there might be some enforcement of the gender in the school or socialization. So also in the impact of the media, there are many of the girls. These are famous girls in the Disney movies, and they are very dependent to the princess. Compared with those princes in the movie, they are tall and charming, physically strong, and very rich. But in these days, there are other types of the Disney movies. So there are no specific romantic relationship, and also the women are doing the leadership roles, and there was no romantic relationship between the biological males and the females. So the trends are different. The trends are changing a lot. So there is also a very big issue of the sex and the gender inequality, because there are many of the issues, because even though they are having the same levels of education, but they are having very different levels of the income. So the sexism again, mentioning that the valuing one gender than another, and the feminism is that there should be the egalitarian or more equality, not only based on the gender, but also considering education or other qualifications. So there is still a very big type of the gender gap, because if we assume the 100 is the male's income, the woman's income, it was 60% of the male's income. There was increasing trends, which means the narrowing down of the gender gap. But at certain point, which means at 99, there was no huge improvement in the narrowing down of the gender pay gap, which means that we saw the stall of the gender revolution. So possibly because there were the gender work devaluation, which means within the same level of the degree or the level of the qualification, the women are doing the nurse aide as the lower rank of the medical professional, and males are doing more the truck driver. So in terms of the education degree, they are very similar. But in terms of the level of the income, the truck drivers are earning more and more compared with the major job, not major job. So the proportion of women are doing the nursing and the psychiatric and the home health aid jobs. But we can see that the males are earning much more than those women, which means the gender devaluation or devaluation of the woman kind of the job. And also the gender segregation in the job market, and also there are highly paid jobs are mostly occupied by males, but low paid jobs are occupied by women. So this is also the possible issue of the gender devaluation. So because of the segregation and also the domestic jobs, women are doing more of the domestic job, which means they would not have enough time to work on their qualification or work on their competition in their job. So these might be the issues of the gender segregation. So there are other issues of the gender education or gender issues, but probably you can look over on those lecture slides and the textbook. Alright, so as I promised, this will be a little bit shorter than the regular lecture as alternative format. Alright, thank you very much for your attention and see you next week.